It was the kind of fear that rattles you to your core, the kind that you can't escape, no matter how hard you try. And for this horse, it wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It was a constant companion. A presence that shadowed every move, every interaction, every day. The horse, once so full of potential, had been left scarred by a world that seemed too big, too loud, and too overwhelming. No matter how much it tried, it couldn't outrun the fear. Every new person, every unfamiliar face, only seemed to heighten the dread. To the outside world, this horse appeared unmanageable, unpredictable. It was the kind of animal that you'd cross the street to avoid, the kind whose eyes betrayed a deep, unshakable terror. But what no one knew, what no one could see, was that this fear didn't come from a place of anger or aggression. It came from pain. A pain so profound that it made trusting anyone almost impossible. And it was in this isolation, this desperate loneliness, that the horse existed. But everything changed the moment one person walked into its life. This wasn't someone who simply saw a frightened creature. This was someone who saw more than just the surface. They didn't flinch when the horse reared, or when it stamped its hooves in panic. They didn't shrink back when the animal tried to pull away, its fear radiating with every breath. Instead, they stood there quietly, with a kind of understanding that felt different, almost like they could see the world through the horse's eyes. At first, the horse wasn't sure what to make of it. Why would someone stick around? Why would anyone try to help? It had never known kindness like this, not from humans. Yet, as days passed, something began to shift. The horse wasn't sure how to name it, but it felt like the weight of its world was getting lighter. The change wasn't instant. There were moments when the fear still held tight, pulling the horse back to its dark corner. But there was also something else now, a small spark of hope, a flicker of trust. And with every quiet moment spent together, that spark began to grow. The horse slowly started to believe in the possibility that it didn't have to live in fear forever. But just when it seemed like things might finally begin to heal, something unexpected happened. A sudden event would challenge everything they'd worked for, threatening to unravel the fragile bond they had started to build. What happens when the one person who truly understands you is tested by a force even they can't control? Will the horse's newfound trust survive the challenge, or will the fear return, stronger than before? The answer, it seems, lies just around the corner, waiting for the next step in their journey, where everything could change once again. But one thing is certain, the path ahead won't be easy. The days after the first encounter were strange for both of them. The horse, despite its fear, had begun to anticipate the quiet presence of the person who had chosen to stay. There was something calming about the way this individual moved, slow, deliberate, never rushing. It wasn't like the others who had come and gone, those who only saw a problem to be fixed. No, this person seemed to have patience in abundance, as though they were willing to wait for the horse to make the decision to trust, without forcing it. But trust was not something easily given. For the horse, it was a fragile thing, like a thread that could snap at any moment. The world it had known was one where trust had been betrayed too many times. It had learned to rely on its own instincts, to shut out anything that might cause it pain again. Still, the presence of this person lingered like a whisper in the air, and slowly, cautiously, the horse began to inch closer. It wasn't much, just a small shift in its posture, a slight lowering of its head when the person came near. These were the moments that felt like breakthroughs, tiny, but profound. For the horse, they were the first steps toward letting go of the fear that had been so tightly woven into its life. But those small victories didn't come without their setbacks. There were days when the fear would return, stronger than before. On those days, the horse would retreat to the farthest corner of the stable, its body trembling, its wide eyes darting with anxiety. No matter how much the person tried to coax it out, there was no escaping the overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't the horse's fault, it had been through too much already. It had seen cruelty and neglect, and it had learned to keep its distance to survive. Those moments of terror weren't simply fears of the present, they were echoes of a past that the horse couldn't escape. And yet, despite the setbacks, something kept pulling the horse back. It wasn't just the person's quiet persistence, it was the warmth that lingered in their presence. There was a quiet reassurance in the way they spoke, their voice soft and steady, like a lullaby that slowly started to calm the storm inside the horse's chest. It was as if the person could understand what the horse needed, even when it couldn't express itself. This understanding went deeper than just actions. There was something in the person's gaze, something in the way they looked at the horse that suggested they saw the horse as more than just an animal in need of help. They saw the fear, yes, but they also saw the potential that the horse had, the power that was buried deep inside, just waiting for the right moment to break free. The horse wasn't just a creature to be fixed. It was a soul who had been lost, but wasn't beyond saving. But even with this bond growing between them, there were moments when doubt crept in. The person would catch themselves wondering if they were really making any difference. Was the horse really changing, or was this just a cycle, a back and forth of progress and regression that would never end? These thoughts, though brief, were like shadows that loomed on the edges of every interaction. The person didn't want to admit it, but they were afraid that the horse would never fully trust again, that the fear would always win. And in those moments, it felt like the horse was testing them, seeing how far it could push before the person finally gave up. But then, just when the doubts began to feel overwhelming, something unexpected would happen. One day, as the person entered the stable, they noticed the horse standing still, its head lowered but its eyes no longer wild with panic. There was a quiet moment, a connection that passed between them, almost imperceptible, but it was there. For the first time, the horse seemed to be waiting for them. There was no fear in its eyes, no desperate need to escape. It was almost as though the horse had decided that it was okay to trust, just a little bit more. And yet, that trust wasn't complete. It couldn't be. The past was still there, hovering like a cloud, always ready to strike. The horse had lived a life of uncertainty, and now that it was beginning to open up again, it wasn't sure if it could take the risk of fully surrendering to the person. So, it took small steps, testing the waters, seeing if this person would stay when things got tough, if they would understand when the fear flared up again. But what the horse didn't know, what it couldn't understand, was that the person was facing a struggle of their own. The bond they had started to form was fragile, and with it came a heavy responsibility. The person had their own fears, their own past. They had once been afraid of the world around them, afraid of failing those they cared about. But they had learned to push through those fears, to trust in the process, to believe that healing was possible. And now, in this strange and unspoken way, they found themselves living that lesson again with the horse. It wasn't just about fixing the horse, it was about fixing something within themselves, too. The horse's fear was a mirror, reflecting the person's own doubts and vulnerabilities. Every time the horse took a step forward, the person felt a small victory, but also a reminder of their own struggles. Every time the horse faltered, they were reminded that healing wasn't a straight path. There were no guarantees, no promises that everything would turn out fine. And yet, both of them kept going, pushing forward, even when the path seemed unclear. But then, just when things seemed to be settling into a fragile routine, an event happened that neither of them had seen coming. One quiet afternoon, as the person approached the stable, they saw something in the distance that made their hearts stop. A group of strangers, people who had no understanding of the horse's journey, were walking toward the stable. Their presence felt like a storm on the horizon, a threat that the person hadn't anticipated. The horse, sensing something was off, tensed immediately. Its body went rigid, its nostrils flaring, the fear suddenly overwhelming its senses. The person tried to calm it, but the horse wasn't listening. It was already spiraling, caught in a panic that felt all too familiar. The strangers were getting closer now, their voices loud and unsettling. The person could see the horse becoming more and more agitated, its eyes wide with terror. They didn't know what to do. They could feel the bond they had worked so hard to create slipping away, just out of reach. But there was something else, too. Something that the person hadn't noticed before. Among the strangers, there was one figure who seemed different, a figure who didn't approach the horse with the usual caution or force. Instead, they stood back, watching quietly. There was something in their eyes, something familiar about the way they observed the horse, as if they, too, understood the pain it was going through. And for a moment, just a moment, the person wondered if this stranger might be the key to something the horse needed, something that they, themselves, couldn't provide. But the tension was mounting, and the fear was palpable. Would this stranger offer help, or would they only make things worse? As the group drew closer, the atmosphere seemed to thicken. The horse was on the brink of full-blown panic, the trust they had begun to build now hanging by a thread. The person stood there, unsure of what to do next, caught between the fear of losing everything they had worked for and the hope that the stranger might be the answer. But the clock was ticking, and every second that passed made it harder to tell what would happen next. The air was thick with tension as the strangers approached the stable. The horse's body trembled violently, its eyes wide and frantic, unable to focus on anything but the encroaching figures. The person stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had worked so hard to build a fragile connection with the horse, and now it felt like everything could crumble in an instant. The horse was slipping into a state of sheer panic, its body shifting restlessly, the tension of its muscles threatening to explode at any moment. The person knew that if they didn't act quickly, the situation could spiral completely out of control. They spoke softly, trying to calm the horse with their voice. But it was as though the animal couldn't hear them, its own fear drowning out any sound. The person took a slow, cautious step forward, their eyes darting between the horse and the strangers. The unfamiliar figures were only a few yards away now. The group didn't seem to understand the situation, their voices louder and more chaotic than necessary. One of them, a man in a faded jacket, was walking directly toward the horse, oblivious to its state of panic. His movements were quick, jerky, as though he was trying to force the horse into submission. The person's stomach dropped. They couldn't let this happen. Not after everything. Their own instincts kicked in, and they rushed forward, raising a hand to signal the man to stop. "Wait!" The command came out louder than they intended, but it caught the attention of everyone. The man halted mid-step, confusion flickering in his eyes. "You can't just walk up to it like that," the person said, their voice shaking slightly. "It's scared. You have to move slowly." The strangers exchanged glances, but they didn't seem to fully understand. One of them, a woman, started speaking, her words too fast and too loud for the person to catch, but it was clear she didn't grasp the gravity of the situation. The person felt a knot form in their stomach. They had come to this place with hope, a quiet belief that the horse's fear could be overcome with time, with patience. But now, they were fighting not only to keep the horse calm but to defend the progress they'd made, to protect what had felt like the beginning of a real bond. Meanwhile, the horse was becoming more agitated. Its eyes darted from person to person, and its body was starting to shudder in fear. The noise and the chaos were too much. The person stepped closer, trying to keep their voice steady as they spoke to the horse, but it wasn't enough. The horse's fear was too deep, too rooted. The more the strangers moved, the more the horse pulled away, its movements frantic as it tried to escape the invisible grip of panic. And then, just as the situation seemed to teeter on the edge, the quiet figure among the strangers spoke up. This person, unlike the others, hadn't moved toward the horse in a hurry. They hadn't raised their voice. Instead, they stood back, watching, their eyes never leaving the animal. Something in their gaze was familiar to the person, something that made them pause. The figure's voice was calm, deliberate, as they addressed the group. "Give it space," they said, and there was an unmistakable authority in their tone, something that made the others hesitate. You're overwhelming it. Let it breathe. The man in the jacket hesitated, looking at the quiet figure as though they were speaking a foreign language. But then he stepped back, slowly, and the tension in the air lightened just a fraction. The horse, sensing the change, stopped pacing for a moment, its head snapping toward the figure. The person, unsure of what this new development meant, took a cautious step back as well. They didn't want to make any sudden movements that would trigger another wave of panic. The figure didn't approach the horse immediately. Instead, they knelt down at the edge of the stable, keeping their distance, their gaze steady but not forceful. The horse, still uneasy, seemed to register the change. Its body remained tense, but its eyes no longer flashed with sheer terror. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a small shift in the atmosphere, like a tiny crack in the wall the horse had built around itself. The person watched, heart pounding, as the figure slowly reached their hand out toward the horse, not in an attempt to touch it, but simply offering a gesture of peace. The horse, despite its fear, didn't pull away. There was no immediate reaction, but something subtle changed in its expression, a slight softening of the lines of terror that had etched themselves so deeply into its face. The person's breath caught. Could it be possible that this stranger understood? Had they known, somehow, how to reach the horse in a way the person hadn't been able to? As the moments passed, the figure remained still, never moving too quickly, never demanding anything of the horse. They simply waited patiently, allowing the animal to take its time. The person felt a mix of hope and anxiety, hope because they had seen the horse respond in ways it hadn't before, and anxiety because they couldn't help but wonder if they had just been replaced. Was this person the answer the horse had been waiting for all along? Was their bond truly that fragile? Or was there something else, something deeper, that the person hadn't yet understood? The horse, still wary, took a hesitant step forward, its hooves tentative on the ground. Its eyes flicked between the person and the stranger, and the tension was thick in the air. The person's heart raced, unsure of what was happening. The stranger hadn't moved, hadn't tried to do anything to force a connection. They were simply being present, offering something the horse had never experienced before, a chance to trust without pressure, without fear of rejection. The horse's ears twitched, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air between them. It was as though the horse was trying to figure out whether or not it could take the next step, whether it could trust this new person in front of it. And then, just as the horse seemed to be leaning toward the stranger, a sudden noise, sharp and unexpected, sounded from outside the stable. It was a car door slamming, loud and jarring. The horse's eyes snapped open wide with alarm, its body tensing once again, the terror returning in full force. It reared up, its hooves crashing against the ground as it backed into the corner of the stable. The person rushed forward, desperate to calm it, but the horse was spiraling again. All the progress, all the fragile steps forward, seemed to disappear in an instant, lost in the wake of that sudden noise. The stranger stood still, watching, their eyes locked on the horse, never moving closer. The person didn't know what to do anymore. They had tried everything, but it felt like no matter how hard they worked, something always set the horse back. Was this horse doomed to live in fear forever? Would anyone ever truly be able to help it? The question gnawed at them, a relentless ache in their chest. As the horse continued to thrash against its fear, the quiet figure spoke again, their voice a soft thread through the chaos. Sometimes you can't force trust, they said, not to anyone in particular, but as though speaking to themselves. Sometimes, all you can do is wait for it to come when it's ready. The person's heart sank as they looked at the horse, still trembling, still uncertain. Was the horse ever going to be ready? Would it ever be able to trust again? Or was the person destined to watch it battle its own fear forever, never fully knowing the answer? The air in the stable was thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken questions and unresolved fear. The horse was still rearing, its body trembling violently, its nostrils flaring as it tried to escape the terror that had overtaken it. Every noise, every movement felt like an assault on its fragile sense of safety. The person stood frozen for a moment, watching as the animal struggled against its own panic, desperate to control the chaos that had gripped the stable. Every part of them wanted to reach out, to somehow calm the horse, but they knew from experience that any sudden movement could make things worse. It felt like the fear was suffocating them both. The quiet stranger remained on the outside, watching, their gaze never leaving the horse. They had said that sometimes, trust had to come on its own time, but those words were starting to feel like empty echoes in the face of the horse's hysteria. The person's heart pounded in their chest, each second dragging on like an eternity. They could feel the horse's fear pressing down on them, suffocating them with its weight. The fear wasn't just coming from the horse anymore, it was starting to creep into their own veins, tightening around them, making them question everything they had worked for. The horse's panic was escalating. It kept backing into the corner, its hooves kicking out wildly, its eyes wide with terror. The sound of its breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, each one a reminder of how far they still had to go. The person felt the sting of helplessness settle deep within them. They had tried everything: gentle words, calm gestures, quiet patience, but none of it was enough. The horse had retreated so far into its fear that it seemed like nothing could reach it anymore. Not even them. A sharp sound, the sudden crack of a wooden beam shifting under the weight of the horse's movements, cut through the tension like a knife. The horse froze for a split second, its ears swiveling toward the noise, but it was a fleeting moment of stillness. The panic surged again, stronger this time, and the horse kicked out with such force that it sent a bucket of water crashing to the ground. The water spilled everywhere, splashing across the floor, but the horse barely noticed. It was too far gone, trapped in its fear. And in that moment, the person felt a desperate urge to act, to do something, anything, to break the cycle. They stepped forward slowly, instinctively reaching for the horse, their hands outstretched. But just as they moved, they caught the eye of the quiet stranger. That one glance stopped them in their tracks. There was something in the stranger's eyes, something deeper than concern, that made the person hesitate. They didn't know what it was, but it was like a silent warning, a reminder that rushing forward might only make things worse. Instead, the person stood still, watching the horse, trying to read its body language, trying to find some small sign that it might calm down. The stranger, however, had moved. Not closer to the horse, but closer to the person. Their presence suddenly felt more pronounced. The tension in the air was palpable, and the horse was like a live wire, ready to snap at any moment. The stranger's voice cut through the chaos, low and steady. "You need to give it space," they said, not unkindly, but with an authority that made the person's gut twist. "It's not about forcing control. It's about letting the horse feel safe enough to make its own choice." The words stung, but they also made sense. The person had been trying so hard to control the situation, to fix everything in an instant, but it wasn't working. They were trying to force the horse to trust them, when in reality, trust wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, in its own time, at its own pace. And maybe, just maybe, they needed to stop trying to rush it. But as the person took a step back, their gaze never leaving the horse, the tension in the stable seemed to reach a breaking point. The horse's panic was growing, a relentless, spiraling force that made everything else fade into the background. The person felt their breath catch, their heart racing. The thought that maybe they had pushed too hard, that they had failed the horse, began to gnaw at them. The fear wasn't just about the horse anymore, it was about them. What if they had made a mistake? What if all of this, everything they had worked for, was just another false hope? Then, in a split second, the horse stopped. Just like that. The panic didn't ease, it stopped, as though it had hit an invisible wall. The air grew still, the silence almost suffocating. The person's heart skipped a beat as they watched the horse's wide eyes flicker, uncertainty replacing the raw terror. The animal stood there, its body tense, but no longer thrashing. The horse was still afraid, but it was no longer running from something. It was caught between fear and curiosity, caught in a delicate balance that seemed too fragile to touch. The stranger, sensing the shift, took a cautious step forward, their movements slow and deliberate. The person held their breath, afraid that any movement, any sound, would send the horse back into its panic. But the stranger didn't rush. They simply knelt down again, their gaze calm, never forcing contact, just offering a silent invitation. The horse didn't retreat. Instead, it leaned slightly forward, its ears flicking toward the stranger, its eyes scanning their face. The person could see it now, the first inkling of trust, the smallest spark of recognition. The horse wasn't fully there yet, but it was no longer completely lost in fear. Something had shifted, something deep within, but whether that shift was enough to heal the bond between the horse and the person, the stranger and the horse, they couldn't tell. And that's when it happened. Another loud sound, this time from the outside world, someone shouting, a car revving its engine. It was sudden, unexpected, and it shattered the fragile moment of peace they had found. The horse jolted back, its body reacting before its mind could catch up. It let out a panicked whinny and bolted toward the far end of the stable, its hooves pounding against the ground. The person's heart dropped again as they watched the horse, still reeling from the shock of the noise, slip back into the spiraling panic. The person stepped forward, but the quiet stranger stopped them with a firm hand on their arm. "Don't," they whispered urgently. "You can't fix this now. Not like this." The person's pulse raced. They could feel the panic rising in their own chest, could feel the overwhelming desire to reach out, to do something, anything to stop the horse from breaking down completely. But they couldn't. The horse was beyond their reach now, consumed by its own fear. And yet, in the chaos, something told them that the resolution was still within reach. Something deep within the horse still recognized them, still remembered the trust they had started to build. The question was whether that trust would survive this final test. Would the horse be able to find its way back from the edge? Or would everything fall apart at the last moment? The answer seemed to hang in the balance, just out of reach, waiting for the next move. The horse's panic was now a living, breathing thing, wild and untamed, as it rushed around the stable. Its hooves beat the ground in frantic rhythm, the sound echoing in the confined space like the beat of a drum, pounding with an urgency that matched the growing fear in the person's chest. They had already seen what the horse was capable of, its strength, its fear, its raw need for escape, but this was different. This wasn't just fear anymore. This was a breaking point. It was the moment when everything, the trust they had fought so hard to build, the fragile understanding they had carefully nurtured, seemed to fall apart. The horse wasn't just running away from fear anymore, it was running away from them. And as the horse careened toward the far end of the stable, its eyes wide and wild, the stranger's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and calm. "It's not just the noise. There's something else." The words didn't register at first. The person was too consumed by the madness in front of them, too focused on the horse's erratic movements to make sense of what had just been said. But then they saw it, something that made their blood run cold. The horse wasn't just reacting to the car outside, or the shouting, it was reacting to something in the air. The tension in the stable wasn't just coming from the noise, it was as if the very atmosphere was thick with it, charged, crackling with an unseen energy. Something was wrong. Something more than just the fear the horse had carried for so long. The stranger's eyes were narrowed, scanning the room, as if they too were trying to piece together the puzzle. "There's someone else here," they muttered, just loud enough for the person to hear. "Someone the horse recognizes." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The person whipped their head around, looking toward the stable door, toward the shadows creeping at the edges of the barn. They had been so focused on the horse, on the strangers, on everything that had already happened that they hadn't noticed it before. The stable was suddenly colder, darker, the air heavier. And in the far corner of the barn, just beyond the flicker of torchlight, stood a figure. The person could barely make out their features, but they could see the way the horse's eyes locked onto them, even in its panicked state. It wasn't the stranger, it wasn't anyone they knew, but the way the horse was reacting, the way its body froze as it caught sight of the figure, made the person's skin crawl. The atmosphere shifted. The barn felt suffocating, as if a dark cloud had settled over the entire space, drowning out the sounds of the world outside. The horse stopped moving, its breathing slowing just enough for the person to realize it wasn't just standing there in fear, it was waiting. Waiting for something. But what? The quiet figure beside the person was watching the scene unfold, their expression unreadable. For a moment, there was a stillness, a deep, unsettling pause before they finally spoke. "That's who the horse is afraid of," they said, their voice low, almost as if they were speaking to themselves. "They don't belong here." The person's stomach turned. Who was this mysterious figure, and why had they been hiding in the shadows of the barn? What did they want with the horse? And more importantly, why was the horse so terrified of them? The tension in the stable was almost unbearable now, a slow burn of fear and uncertainty that made it impossible to think clearly. The person wanted answers, but at that moment, they weren't sure they were ready for what they might find. The figure in the corner didn't move. It was as if they were waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The air was thick with anticipation, every second stretching longer than the last. The horse's body was taut, its muscles trembling, and its eyes wide, desperate, were fixed on the dark figure. The room felt like it was holding its breath, a fragile quiet that seemed ready to shatter at any moment. The person glanced at the stranger, searching for any sign of understanding, any hint of recognition. But the stranger was already moving. Their hand reached out toward the horse, their voice a steady murmur. But it was too late. The horse whinnied sharply, a piercing cry that seemed to echo off the walls. It was a sound of pure terror, a sound that cut straight through the stillness of the barn like a blade. The horse lurched forward, nearly knocking over a stack of hay bales as it moved toward the exit with frantic, panicked speed. The figure in the corner didn't flinch. They remained unmoving, as if they were part of the shadows themselves. "Get out of the way!" The stranger shouted, stepping in front of the person, their voice frantic now. "The horse is too far gone. It won't listen to anyone now." But the words felt like nothing more than an echo against the deafening sound of the horse's hooves pounding the ground, each step a frantic attempt to escape the invisible grip of fear that had taken hold of it. The person's heart was racing, their chest tight with the weight of it all. Every instinct screamed at them to do something to stop the horse, to fix the chaos, but they felt powerless, trapped in a whirlwind of uncertainty and terror. And just as the horse reached the door, its body quivering with fear, the figure finally stepped forward, their movements sudden and deliberate. The stranger's hand shot out, trying to stop the horse from escaping, but the figure in the corner was faster. Their eyes locked on the animal, and the horse stopped dead in its tracks. The barn seemed to fall silent, the world pausing for a brief moment. The horse stood frozen, its chest rising and falling with each labored breath, its body still trembling but no longer moving. The person felt a chill crawl up their spine as they realized that the tension between the horse and the figure was palpable, like the calm before a storm, like a quiet before everything fell apart. Then the figure spoke, their voice carrying a weight of authority that shook the air around them. "You shouldn't have brought it here," they said, their words cutting through the silence like a blade. "You've opened something you can't control." The person's pulse quickened. What did that mean? What had they done by trying to help the horse? The implications of the figure's words began to sink in, and with it came the terrifying realization that whatever had been set in motion, whatever had awakened the horse's deep, unshakable fear, might be something far beyond their understanding. The stakes had shifted. The horse's fear wasn't just about its past anymore, it was about something darker, something that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. The horse's eyes locked on the figure one last time, and for the briefest moment, it seemed to relax, as if it had accepted its fate. But then, in a burst of energy that was both desperate and defiant, it bolted. The stable door flew open, and the horse disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but the heavy silence that followed. The person stood there, breathless, their mind racing. What had they just witnessed? And more importantly, what had they unleashed? The night air was thick with tension as the barn door slammed open, the sounds of the horse's frantic hooves echoing into the distance. The person stood frozen in place, heart pounding, watching as the animal disappeared into the darkness. There was no stopping it now. The horse had broken free, and in doing so, it had shattered everything they thought they understood. The mystery had deepened, and all the questions that had once seemed so distant now crashed down on them like a tidal wave. What was this force that had such a hold on the animal? Why had the horse reacted the way it had? And most terrifying of all, what had they truly unleashed? The stranger stood still for a long moment, their gaze never leaving the open door. The barn was eerily quiet now, the silence almost unbearable after the chaos. The person's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, trying to piece together the fragments of the story that had been slowly revealing themselves. But there were too many unanswered questions. Too many things they didn't understand. As the seconds ticked by, they could feel their pulse quicken, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. Finally, the stranger spoke, their voice low and calm. "It's not over," they said, almost as if they had been waiting for the horse to make its move. "You thought you were helping, but the truth is, you've just begun to uncover something much darker than you realize." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, thick with meaning, but the person was too overwhelmed to process them fully. They turned to the stranger, desperation creeping into their voice. "What do you mean? What's going on here? What's happening to the horse?" The stranger's expression was unreadable, but there was something in their eyes, something that suggested they knew more than they had let on. "The horse was never just afraid of people," they said quietly, stepping closer to the person. "It was afraid of itself." The words made no sense at first. The person's confusion was written all over their face, but the stranger didn't stop. They continued, their voice steady and filled with a strange certainty. "This horse. It was cursed. There's something in its blood, something ancient that has been passed down through generations. It's a creature bound to a power it doesn't understand, a force that has haunted its lineage for as long as it has existed. That's why it's so afraid. It's not the people. It's not the world around it. It's the fear of what it carries inside." The person felt their breath catch in their throat, the weight of the stranger's words settling in like a stone in their stomach. The idea of a curse, of something ancient and untouchable, seemed almost too far-fetched to comprehend. But the look in the stranger's eyes told them this wasn't just some wild tale. This was something real. Something dark. "But why now?" the person asked, their voice trembling. "Why did it all start when we brought the horse here?" The stranger's lips tightened, as if they were grappling with their own reluctance to speak the truth. "Because you've awoken it," they said quietly, their gaze flickering toward the stable door. "This horse didn't want to be found. It didn't want anyone to know what it was running from. But now, it's too late. The thing it fears, the thing that's been chasing it for years, has been drawn here. And it's only a matter of time before it catches up." A chill ran down the person's spine as they realized the full extent of what had just been set in motion. This wasn't just about the horse anymore. This was something bigger. Something far more dangerous. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but as the person strained their ears to listen, they realized what it was. Hooves. The sound was coming from the distance, faint but growing louder with every passing second. The person's heart skipped a beat. The horse, was it returning? Had it come back to finish what it had started? The stranger's face darkened, and without another word, they turned and moved toward the stable door. "It's not the horse you need to worry about," they said, their voice tinged with urgency. "It's what's coming for it." The person's stomach twisted in knots as they followed the stranger outside, into the night. The sound of hooves was now unmistakable, louder, closer. They both stood there, staring out into the dark, waiting for whatever was coming to reveal itself. And then they saw it. In the distance, moving through the fog, a figure on horseback. The silhouette was unmistakable, a rider cloaked in shadow, their form barely visible under the dim light of the moon. The horse they rode was massive, its body black as night, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, eerie light. The rider didn't seem to notice them at first, their focus entirely on the direction the horse had fled. But as the figure drew closer, the person could feel the air around them grow colder. The temperature seemed to drop, the very earth beneath their feet vibrating with an unsettling power. The stranger's face paled as they watched the rider approach. There was no denying the fear in their eyes now. This wasn't just a man or woman on a horse. This was something else. Something dark and ancient. And as the figure drew closer, the person realized with a sickening twist in their gut that the horse hadn't just been running away. It had been running towards something. And that something was now standing right before them. The rider stopped just at the edge of the barnyard, their horse snorting in the mist, its eyes locked on the person and the stranger. The tension in the air was palpable, thick and heavy, as if the very earth was holding its breath. The stranger stepped forward, their hand raised in a silent gesture to stop the person from moving any closer. "Don't," the stranger said quietly, but there was no mistaking the urgency in their voice. "This is what I was afraid of. This is what the horse was afraid of." The rider dismounted slowly, their movement fluid, almost predatory. As they did, the person could see their face for the first time. The features were sharp, almost too perfect, too still. And their eyes, the eyes were something else entirely. The color of the rider's gaze was a deep, unnatural gold, burning with an intensity that made the person's skin crawl. "You've awakened the curse," the rider said, their voice soft but carrying a weight that seemed to hang in the air. "Now you must deal with the consequences." In that moment, everything clicked. The truth that had been lurking in the shadows, the fear the horse carried, the power it was bound to, the mystery of what had been unleashed was standing right in front of them. But even as the person tried to process the enormity of it all, they could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. The last twist of fate was already set in motion. And they realized, with a horrifying clarity, that they weren't the ones in control anymore. The rider smiled, a thin, cruel smile that sent a shiver down their spine. "It's too late to turn back now," they said, their words heavy with finality. "You've already played your part. Now, the horse must face its true fate." The rider's cold, golden eyes locked onto the person's, as if measuring them, weighing their worth. The silence between them stretched on, thick and unyielding, each passing second carrying more weight than the last. The person could feel their breath catch in their throat, the reality of the situation beginning to settle in. This wasn't just a nightmare, this was real. The curse. The fear. The ancient power the horse had been running from for so long. The rider's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was nothing comforting about it. "You've unleashed something you cannot contain," they said, their voice like ice, yet strangely serene. The horse, the fear, the curse, it was never meant to be disturbed. But now it is. And now you must face what you've awakened. The person tried to gather their thoughts, but the fear and confusion clouded their mind. They had no idea who this rider was, or how they were connected to the horse's torment. What had they been running from? Why was the horse so terrified? And why had it seemed to be running toward the rider? There were too many questions, too many pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The stranger beside the person stepped forward, their eyes still fixed on the rider. You've come for the horse, they said, their voice shaking slightly, but there was a trace of defiance there too. What do you want with it? The rider didn't respond immediately. Instead, they let out a slow breath, as though considering the question. The horse is part of a much larger story than you understand, they said at last, their voice soft but heavy with unspoken meaning. It's been cursed for generations, bound to a force that seeks to control it. But it's not just the horse that's been cursed. It's its bloodline. And now you've brought it to the surface. You've forced it to confront its past. The person's mind raced, trying to make sense of the rider's words. A bloodline? A curse that had lasted for generations? They glanced at the stranger beside them, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the stranger's face was grim, their eyes clouded with a mixture of fear and understanding. The curse was never meant to end, the stranger murmured. It's a part of the horse's lineage. A darkness that's been passed down for as long as anyone can remember. The horse was always destined to carry it. The person swallowed hard, the weight of the truth beginning to settle on their shoulders. The horse wasn't just an animal running from fear, it was an unwilling vessel, carrying something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The rider took a step forward, their presence suddenly overwhelming, like a shadow that stretched across the entire barn. And now that it has been disturbed, the curse will seek its next victim. It will not stop until the bloodline is broken. Their eyes flickered toward the stranger, and then to the person. And you, they said, their voice turning cold, are the ones who will decide if it ends or if it continues. The person's heart hammered in their chest. They had been thrust into a story they never asked to be a part of, caught between forces that were far beyond their comprehension. But they couldn't back down now. They couldn't just let the curse continue, couldn't let the horse suffer for something that had happened before they had even arrived. They had to find a way to end it. To break the cycle. Is there a way to stop it? The person asked, their voice almost pleading. They had to know. They had to find a solution, some way to undo the damage they had unknowingly caused. The rider's eyes narrowed, the golden hue of their gaze deepening as if they were seeing through the person, seeing everything that lay beneath the surface. The horse must face its past, they said, their tone dark and final. The curse will only end when it confronts the one who bound it. Until then, it will continue to run, to hide, to fear. It will never be free. The person felt a wave of helplessness wash over them. It wasn't enough to simply try to help the horse. It needed something far more profound. Something that could only be achieved by confronting the very source of its fear, by facing whatever had cursed it in the first place. But just as the person began to feel the weight of defeat settling in, the stranger beside them spoke up again, their voice firm and filled with a quiet resolve. There's more to the story. Something we haven't told you. The horse, the bloodline, they're connected to a ritual. A way to break the curse. But it's dangerous. It will require a sacrifice. The words hit like a shockwave, causing the person to reel back. A sacrifice? The idea sent a chill down their spine, but there was no time to hesitate. The horse's life, its freedom, depended on this. They had to understand what it meant. The stranger looked at the rider, their eyes locked in an unspoken exchange, before turning back to the person. We can help you, they said, their voice steady now. But it's up to you. The ritual must be performed by the one who awakened the curse. And that is you. The person's stomach twisted. They didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that they were the only one who could end the suffering. But the gravity of the situation was undeniable. The curse had been unleashed, and now it was their responsibility to stop it. The rider stepped back, their presence no longer as suffocating, but the air around them remained heavy, charged with the power of what was to come. The decision is yours, they said. Choose carefully. Once the ritual begins, there will be no turning back. The person stood there, torn between fear and determination. The horse was out there, somewhere in the dark, still running. But they couldn't leave it to its fate. They had to try. They had to stop this curse before it consumed everything. Without another word, they turned toward the stable, the door swinging open with a creak that seemed to echo through the night. The stranger and the rider followed close behind, the weight of the moment pressing in from every side. The air was thick with anticipation, with a sense of finality that couldn't be ignored. Inside the stable, the horse stood waiting, its form silhouetted against the dim light of the barn. It was still, its breath coming in shallow, quick bursts. Its eyes, wide with fear and uncertainty, met the person's gaze as they stepped closer. For a moment, everything seemed to pause, the air heavy, the world standing still. The person could feel the tension in the room, the power of the curse almost palpable. But they knew what had to be done. They couldn't run from it. They had to face it, for the horse, for the bloodline, for everything that had been set in motion. Taking a deep breath, the person stepped forward, their hand reaching out toward the horse. It flinched at first, but as the person gently touched its mane, something changed. The air seemed to shift, the darkness in the barn fading just a little. The horse's breathing slowed, and for the first time since they had arrived, it seemed at peace. But the person knew it wasn't over yet. They closed their eyes, focusing on the ritual that had been passed down through generations, on the sacrifice it required. The stranger and the rider stood silent in the background, watching, waiting for the moment to come. The barn was still, quiet, except for the sound of the horse's breathing and the distant wind outside. And then, with a final, decisive movement, the person spoke the words of the ritual. The curse that had haunted the horse for so long began to unravel, the air vibrating with the power of it. There was a sharp, sudden pain, a feeling like being torn between two worlds, but it didn't last long. And when it was over, the horse stood still, calm, no longer trembling. The air shifted, and the rider stepped forward once again, their golden eyes now softer, no longer filled with the same cold, intimidating power. "It's done," they said, their voice quieter now. "The curse is broken." The person opened their eyes, the weight of the moment sinking in. The horse was no longer bound by its fear. It was free. The cycle had ended. And as the sun began to rise on the horizon, casting light over the barn, the person realized that in facing the darkness, they had not only saved the horse, but they had also freed themselves from the fear that had bound them too. And in the end, that was the most important thing of all.